Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and as ever, wherever you are in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues this week of Holocaust Memorial Day with our guest Ingrid Alpen, and I'll introduce Ingrid in just one moment. You're very welcome to ask questions. Please do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as ever, we'll try to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility, which will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, this event is being recorded and it will be visible on our website at milim.org.uk, where you will find recordings of other past events and also details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest today. Ingrid Alpen is a Smith College graduate who taught about the Holocaust before beginning her career as an attorney in Washington, DC. She now does public policy work for a disability non-profit. Ingrid is author of My Separate Worlds, Daughter of the Holocaust and Evangelical Christianity, which is published along with another short book, The Doll. As well as this, she has also published poetry and essays. Ingrid joins us from Rockville, Maryland this evening. Hello, Ingrid, and a very warm Milim welcome to you.
Hello, Jonathan. I'm delighted to be here.
Very nice to have you. Now, the book is called My Separate Worlds, Daughter of the Holocaust and Evangelical Christianity. So without giving too much away at this stage, what is the book about?
I just wanted to change it so it was gallery. Excuse me for being a Zoomie. The book, what is the book about? Actually, it is about a little known escape of a family, a Dutch family from Vichy, from the Netherlands through Vichy, France, onto a ship from Lisbon to Suriname in South America. And it's so little known that recently the Dutch government gave a grant to a graduate student to study the escape of the people who met on that ship. They were primarily Jewish people who were on that ship, refugees. And she just got a fellowship at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So this is not a big topic among Holocaust researchers yet.
So this is your family story, and I suppose this is a memoir of your experience of having heard this from your family. Now, I'm interested in how you found your voice. Did you study writing? Were you encouraged to write by anybody? Did somebody tell you it was a good idea to tell this story?
That's an interesting question, how I found my voice. From the time I learned to read, always had my head stuck in a book. And I wanted more than anything to write one, because this is what I lived with and admired. And eventually, and so I just wrote. I sat down and wrote, and eventually I went to the Banff School of Fine Arts on the basis of a manuscript and breadloaf. But I realized I didn't want to be a writer. I did want to be a writer, but I didn't want to live off my writing. And I wanted to go to law school. Teaching about the Holocaust made me realize how much I wanted to go to law school so I could help other people with my legal skills. And eventually, because my mother filled my life with her stories about the escape and her life that she had lost, it all poured out. And became this book.
Well, it's a very beautifully written book and it's very evocative, but you call it creative nonfiction. What do you mean by that?
Oh, creative nonfiction uses the tools of fiction, plot, character, storytelling more than plot, but characters, dialogue, scenes, and it tells true stories. But it uses those tools to bring out the emotions of the story.
Okay. And I think we'll come back to your love of books later. That's maybe a theme we'll explore in a bit more detail. But for now, let's talk about your mother and indeed your grandmother, because they were both part of this escape. And they are, I suppose, very much defined in the book by this escape. That's their, that's their sort of defines their characters. So what can you tell us about your mother and your grandmother and indeed their escape?
Well, I'll start with my grandmother because the story of our escape is really a story of heroism and hope. And my grandmother knew that they should leave the Netherlands in 1933 when Hitler came to power in Germany, but she could not convince my grandfather. And even when the Jews were subject to all kinds of laws and their property was confiscated and they had to register, they had to sew Jewish stars on their clothes, she couldn't convince my grandfather. When the Nazis beat him up at work and he died the next morning, she engineered the escape of our family. As a widow, immediately, this is the kind of strong person she was. So my mother was very strong too, very much like my grandmother. Rumor has it from other cousins in the family, me being one of the cousins, that my mother was quite instrumental in helping my grandmother engineer this escape.
Do you want to elaborate a bit on the escape? Because I think in common with many other escape narratives, there were many, many points along the way where they very nearly got caught, where it very nearly failed, but ultimately they prevailed. So you say they started in the Netherlands.
Yes. They went without papers because their papers were marked with J's. And so they didn't have time to get papers and they left so late that in fact, and my mother, it was my mother, my grandmother, and my mother's younger sister. My mother was age 18. The younger sister was, I think, 16. And they left with no papers and took a train to the southern part of the Netherlands, where they were going to meet at a farmhouse. I should back up a minute and explain that my grandmother hired passeurs to take them out, to tell them what would be the safest train to take, because the Germans were checking the papers on some trains and then they would get tired of it and they wouldn't check some trains. And so the passeur directed them to which train to take and where to meet at the farmhouse. And they left with 20 people. That my grandmother actually hired the passeur for those 20 people. And that it was very dangerous to be on the train because who knew if the passeur was really right, but they made it down to that farmhouse. And then they spent the night there and walked across the border. And from then on, it was mostly walking. They walked across the border into Belgium. And at that moment, my mother said to me, I ask God to please, please let me survive the escape. I might add, just to add dark humor here, she was carrying a great big bag of tomatoes. And That was the only food they had. And she wanted to put it down. She kept begging my grandmother, "Can I put this down? It's too heavy. I can't walk with this." And my grandmother said, "It's the only food we have. Keep carrying it." But I grew up with these stories. At different points in my life, when something was happening, for example, when we were cutting tomatoes, when I was a small child, my mother would tell me that part of the story. And there were parts of the story of my life that would remind her of hers, and she relived her life through mine. And she talking about it just helped revive. But anyway, back to the escape. So the book is dedicated to Sally Noach, who saved the lives of my grandmother, my mother, and my mother's younger sister when they reached Lyon in Vichy, France, because at that time, unknown to my family, in the 1 month before my family reached Vichy, France, the Vichy police, the French police, had rounded up 15,000 Jews to hand them over to Hitler in a deal that Pétain had made. Pétain was the ruler of Vichy, France, made with Hitler, that I'll hand over all the Jewish refugees who come in if you stay out of southern France. And of course, Hitler took the Jews and came into southern France anyway. But what Sally Noach did, when they reached Lyon, they needed Dutch papers, Dutch identity papers. So they went to my 3 women in my family, went to the Dutch consulate in Lyon. And Sally Noach was working there. He was a Jewish man hiding his identity with a non-Jewish name. They didn't know who he was. And they, of course, didn't say, "Hi, we're Jews. We have no papers." They lied to him and about why they didn't have papers. But of course, he knew they were Jews. And he gave them papers that said Calvinist. In the book, I call it Protestant because that's what we know in the United States, Protestant. And that's the way my mother referred to it. And he gave them a non-Jewish name on the papers. Those papers saved their lives. They went down to Nice because they were meeting my mother's older sister and her husband there. They had left first because the Netherlands first because my uncle Rob was military age and they were worried about what might happen to him under German occupation. So every night in the hotel in Nice, there was a circular staircase. And my mother said, we would hear, well, can I read a little part of it about that?
Yes, please do.
Okay. For nearly 2 months in a hotel in Nice, the Garden Hotel, where honeymoons and sex trysts took place at other times in history, my mother, her younger sister, and my grandmother, whom we call moms, then the sole survivors of the group of 20 with whom they had left the Netherlands, waited to get their transit visas across Spain to Portugal. They came every night, my mother told me. The Vichy police. We heard their boots on the circular stairs near our room, very loud. I always thought, they're coming for me. Then we heard the screams of other Jews being pulled from their rooms and down that circular staircase. The screams of those Jews I will never forget as long as I live. Every night, these accomplices of Hitler banged on the door to the room where those 3 women stood. Any Jews in this room? The uniformed figures shouted as they looked under the bed and into the closets. And every night, Mom showed their Protestant papers from the Dutch consul in Lyon, their savior, Sally Noach. As soon as they saw those papers, they always apologized for bothering us, my mother said.
Did they find Solly after the war? Did Solly survive the war?
They found Solly during the war. A few months later, they found him in north of Lisbon. Everybody who had to, all the Jews who went into Portugal were forced to stay in a big mansion on a beach near Lisbon. And the people whom he had helped were there, and they met him, they saw him. And so they talked to him and, of course, found out that he was a Jew too and learned the whole story. He had helped hundreds of people, maybe more than hundreds. And they wrote thank you notes to him. I have a copy from Sally Noah's son, whom I met. Well, I haven't met him, but I met him online. That was part of my research. We can talk about that. And so they wrote him a thank you note, and my mother wrote him a letter from Suriname, thanking him and tutoying, speaking to him in the familiar and calling him Sally, which is a thing my mother never did with people she wasn't really close friends with. And in the letter, she even apologizes for tutoying him, but she was so grateful to him. So yes, they did meet.
So who of your family made it out of the Netherlands to the United States? Obviously you, your mother, your grandmother, and any other members of your family?
I was born in the United States. Okay. I was born shortly after
your mother and your grandmother.
Yes, my mother, my grandmother, my mother's younger sister, my mother's older sister, and my uncle. 5 people made it out to Suriname.
Now, when your family lived in the Netherlands, how religiously observant were they? And is that something that changed as a result of their leaving?
They were very observant Jews. They went to the Portuguese synagogue in Den Haag, and they walked to synagogue. My mother would describe my grandfather with his top hat, and the men were down below and the women were in the balcony, and she always got a special new dress for Rosh Hashanah. But they were very, very observant. They kept Shabbat, and she had the job of tearing all the family's toilet paper before Shabbat, which she hated, but that was her job because you can't tear toilet paper on Shabbat. That's how religious they were. When my mother came to, when my mother took off the star off of her clothes and shut the door of her house, she was afraid and walked out of their house to the train station in Den Haag to leave. The beginning of the escape, she was afraid to tell anyone that she was Jewish. And that fear continued through, of course, the whole escape, because that's obvious. And when she got to the United States, somebody told her that there are people you have to be very afraid of, and those are the Jews. This was a non-Jewish woman, of course. So my mother was afraid to talk about it in the United States too.
Now, you, as you say, were born in the United States, and where were you born? What memories do you have of your early childhood?
Okay. I was born in the United States in Washington, D.C., and my memories of my early childhood begin with my mother and my father fighting. And the reason for that is that when my mother came to the United States, she did not want to be Jewish anymore. So she married my father, who was not Jewish. And he was from a very small town in Indiana. And she realized very soon that she did want to remain Jewish. So when I was I was born within, they really wanted a child right away. And I was born within the 12 months after their marriage. And when I was 2 years old, my mother and I showed up on the doorstep of the apartment where my Dutch family lived. And at that point, it was my mother's older sister, Tante Sonia, and her husband, Uncle Rob, Mom's, my grandmother, and my cousin Lenny, who had been born in Suriname. So we all lived in one tiny apartment as refugees do. And I remember how wonderful our life was there. But, I want to step back for a minute to show you how important that wonderful life was in that apartment by reading you a part of a letter that I recently received because I wrote the book. A distant cousin found me, and he translated a letter that my Uncle Rob wrote. And it's his first letter after the escape to Tante Sonia's cousin, who somehow survived in the Netherlands. And my Uncle Bob wrote, September 23, 1945, Paramaribo, Suriname. It nearly seems to have been an unbelievable bad dream, but regretfully, it wasn't a dream, but the reality. A tremendous number of things have happened, and the emotional upset is so enormously large that it is difficult to process. My brother writes me that he has become hard through all the horrors, but what really has played out in our inner emotions is impossible to describe and cannot be gauged by any of us. This overwhelms even the strongest family. But how can words help? How can sighs help? How can crying help? It is more easily said than done, but we are facing established facts, and we are obliged to move forward and not look backwards.
That's pretty powerful. So you're living with your aunt. Do you see anything of your father?
Yes, he came every weekend. He picked me up and he took me places that I enjoyed going to. And then he took me, the most wonderful place he took me was Crawfordsville, Indiana, which was to meet his family. I was only 4 years old, but I could remember then. I was old enough to be able to remember that. And he took me alone for the first time I could remember to meet his family, our family. And they showed me snapdragons and fireflies and green lizards and a swinging bridge, and how they held hands around the dinner table and prayed in Jesus' name, amen, which of course my Dutch family didn't do. They were Methodist, they were not evangelical Christians, but my father became an evangelical Christian, a very fundamentalist Christian.
And did he try to persuade you to follow his faith?
Yes, he did. He definitely did. we moved to Texas, and he came to visit me twice a year in Texas. First of all, I had to keep, when we moved there and he started to visit me, all of a sudden, well, you know, I haven't told you that my life changed before we moved to Texas and why. But he would come every year and visit me. And I was then just 6 years old when we first moved. I had a new Jewish daddy, and we were very close, and he taught me my first Jewish law. He taught me that you're Jewish if you have a Jewish mother. And my new Jewish aunt wrapped me in her old gauzy curtain until I became Queen Esther, and she took me to my first Purim festival. But so we began religious training for me. We were Reform Jews, not modern Orthodox or ultra Orthodox. And Judaism was a very, very strong part of my life. It became really the strongest thread of my life.
You speak very little in the book of your Jewishness until this point where your mother remarries, and you, as you say, you get a new father who you call Dad throughout the book, even though he's not your biological father. But this did this sort of bring out your mother's Jewishness as well? Do you think this was the catalyst to stop her hiding who she really was?
Oh, yes. Yes, she felt secure again. She felt secure with her Jewish husband, and that's what she wanted. And they were both very, very strongly identifying Jews, but not so much from a religious point of view, you know, from an ultra Orthodox or even a modern Orthodox point of view, but very, very strongly identifying. Every night at dinner, Dad would have discussions with me about what was ethically, you know, ethical discussions. He would raise questions, and that's the way Jewish fathers teach their children.
Now, your family seem to find a lot of home comforts in America. And a lot of the things that your mother and grandmother, I think, would have eaten or done before they left the Netherlands, they managed to recreate. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Okay, well, I will tell you that we did Uncle Rob's story or letter raises the question that, you know, we have to go on, and our family did go on. We went on. We had picnics. We had museum trips. We did so many wonderful things together. We went hiking and had small dinner parties and potluck dinners with music groups. And here is a very small a paragraph about the food. It's right on point, Jonathan. After my mom and I showed up on the doorstep of Tante Sonia and Uncle Rob of their apartment, in good weather, we made trips on the weekends to Uncle Rob's favorite place, Haynes Point in Washington, D.C. Haynes Point meant sunshine, white-winged sailboats on blue water, green grass where Lenny and I ran round and round our yellow and white striped blanket with its frayed satin border, where the grown-ups sat and unpacked food from crumpled paper grocery bags, sandwiches of heavy dark bread, in the uneven slices that moms cut from the shiny crusted loaf, thick pieces of chowder, or sometimes borscht, and always half-done pickles, apples, oranges, and cookies.
Amazing. Now, your mother at some point gives your father, your biological father, a name, and it's a rather derogatory name. It appears it's not quite as derogatory in the colloquial American as it is in Yiddish. It's probably a little bit worse, but either way, this I think is the point where you start talking about two worlds, two different worlds, and also talking about feeling different from your peers. So how did you feel different, and why?
Well, not only did my mother call my father this name, and I tried to, yes, make it a little bit less like the Yiddish in my book, and it was a terrible name, but she also told me that I had to keep his visits and his existence secret. So at that point, and this was right around the time when I started first grade, I began living a double life. I was living in the world that did not exist anywhere else. I didn't ever tell anyone. I never betrayed my parents. And then I lived in the real world with my Jewish family, my cousins, everybody. We visited every summer. And my friends lived normal lives, it seemed to me. I thought they could talk about anything. Of course, I don't know about the secrets in their lives. Maybe they had them, but I couldn't really be completely close to any friend because I had a secret life too that I couldn't talk about. And it was very much a part of my life. When my closest friend, we called each other sisters. We still are very close and talk on the phone all the time. She's down in Texas, I'm up in Maryland, but I couldn't tell her what I was doing on Christmas vacation or in the summer. And I would make up things. I would tell her, oh, I just read a book. You know, I read a good book, which is true, but I did more than that. I was with my father and I couldn't talk about it.
And how did that make you feel?
It made me feel that I couldn't be close to anybody. There was no way to be close to anybody.
Now he meets a new partner, and did that change him at all?
No, he had already changed before that. He had become a fundamentalist Christian, which I learned later on in my life was different from the rest of his family, from whom I was estranged by my mother. And he had 3 sisters. So he became very, very religious and strict. And for example, he was so strict that eventually I did manage to meet his younger sister. And she was age 70 and she and her male friend were living together without marriage because they didn't want to get married again. And they had other families. And when they went to visit my father and his second wife, my father would not allow them to stay in his house because they weren't married.
Now the family moves to Dallas. You're growing up now. As an older, slightly older person, do you manage to open up to any of your friends at that point, or are you still keeping these secrets close to your chest?
Oh no, I was keeping everything secret. Everything. One time I talked with another very close friend in Dallas and opened up to her about the escape and told her part of the story, because at that time people didn't talk about the Holocaust at all. Not until the miniseries in 1978, when it was on television, and then people felt more like talking about it. But I actually told her about it, and she was very surprised and touched by it. And I was thinking, and she said, "It means so much to me that you told me something so personal." And I'm thinking to myself, you should only know when I'm not telling you.
At some point, you stop these. Your father stops visiting, or you stop seeing him. What caused that?
Well, it was legal. My mother had a visited child. I don't know what you call it right now, because I'm a tax lawyer, not a divorce lawyer. The visitation rights stopped, and so he couldn't come anymore, and I was age 17, and I was just thinking about the part where he wanted to teach me about his religion, but I don't know if we have time for me to read a short from that. Okay. This was when I was 10 or 11, but it gives you a good idea of how relieved I was when my father stopped visiting, when his visitation rights stopped. I guess it was a child custody agreement is what it's called legally. He also wanted to teach me religion. And one thing I have to tell you is I decided I would speak to him as little as possible. That seemed like the only way not to betray my Jewish parents when I was with this terrible father, this terrible man, whom she had turned me against him. And I had to be with this man who was so terrible. This is my winter break when I was 10 or 11 years old. On the afternoon of the event that made this visit so memorable, we arrived in his motel room after seeing a Disney movie. The small room was filled with a narrow dresser, double bed, and 2 straight-back chairs beside a tiny round table. I sat on a chair. He walked over to the dresser and picked up a black book. It was the book known to me as the Christian Bible. He did this every Christmas vacation. He read me the story of the birth of Jesus. This year I spoke. Please don't read that to me. I gave no explanation. I did not say that I'm Jewish. And when he reads to me from the Christian Bible, I feel awful because it's not part of my religion. Maybe if I'd explained, he would have told me I was baptized as a Methodist at birth, and that made me a Methodist. If only I could have talked to him, maybe I would have told him that I respected his religion and wished he would respect mine. Could he have accepted that his daughter was Jewish when his religion was so important to him? I ran into the bathroom. He followed me and stood in the bathroom doorway to block my escape. All 6'3" of him loomed over me, stern, foreboding, like Cotton Mather. Sit down, he commanded, and pointed to the closed toilet. I stood still. The situation was ludicrous, and I did not want anything to do with that book. Sit down. I remained standing. He advanced toward me. Sit down or I'll turn you over my knee. A thing he'd never done before and never threatened. He was a monstrous tremble of rage bent toward me. I sat on the hard surface of the closed toilet seat. He sat across from me on the bathtub edge, put the book on his gargantuan knees, and began to read, slowly enunciating every word in his deep baritone. And his visits ended before my 17th birthday, and I was very relieved.
And you didn't see him for how long?
I didn't see him for 19 years after that.
Okay. So what happened to reconcile you with your father? And was there a point at which these secrets stopped being secrets? When, if indeed did you start to share the stories of your past with anybody else?
What happened was that I met my husband, and I was not a youngster. I waited a long time and finally met somebody I trusted implicitly, who was absolutely my best friend. And I knew I wanted to marry this person. And at my grandmother's Shiva, during the Shiva, I took him out of the house. I said, there's something terrible I have to tell you about myself. I owed it to him. I knew he needed to know this awful thing about me. So I told him the secret, and he started laughing. He said, what's terrible about that? There's nothing terrible. And he convinced me that I needed to meet my father to confront my own identity. And it was terrible. It was very frightening for me, very, very frightening. At that point in my life, it was the most frightening thing I'd ever done. But I did. That took 2 years of working through that. And then I met my husband 17 years after, my father's visitation rights ended. And then I started writing him letters. That's how we started, snail mail. And he answered me right away. I learned that he felt his calling was to teach his religion to other people by writing songs and singing them all over the country. And I had already had a terrible, for me in first grade, a very emotional experience when I had to stand up and say the Lord's Prayer in my classroom. And I said the Shema under my breath because that insulated me from the surroundings. And I found out that one of the songs that my father wrote was about how we needed to have prayer in the school. By that time, the US Supreme Court had ruled that prayer in the school was unconstitutional in public school. And my father was writing a song to sing around the country about how prayer in the school was very important. So you can see the distance between us. And he wrote me letters with very, very pious words that I hadn't really been exposed to before. I wasn't sure how I was going to ever really get close to him. And then I discovered the key. The key was to ask what makes him act the way he does.
And were you able to repair your relationship with him?
I was.
Did he stop trying to convert you?
He did.
That's good.
He did. We moved, as we began to reach each other, we also reached ourselves. We discovered the elements of ourselves that each of us were unwilling to change. Of course, I knew what they were, and he probably did too about himself. But we discovered that we could respect those elements about each other. We could talk openly and honestly. And he had said from his very first letter, he had used very pious or religious words to say what I just said, that I hope that someday you and I can be so honest with each other that I finally did.
Do you want to just say the last 10 or 15 seconds again? Because you froze. We missed the last.
Oh, yeah, my internet connection is unstable. That's life these days. Okay, I don't know what the last 10 sentences were.
The last few seconds.
I had learned to understand his pious words. And what I really learned from him was the power of reaching out to another person and being able to touch each other emotionally.
Now, when he passes away, your dad, your new dad, says he did you a favor, and it struck me as a very cruel thing to say. How did you feel about that?
I knew the instant Dad said that he was wrong. But he wasn't here, and I had sheltered my Jewish parents to a certain extent. They knew that I was going to meet my father. In a sense, I asked permission from them. I wanted them, if they had said, no, you can't do it, I still would have done it. But they didn't say that. I just wanted them to know what was happening. I owed it to them because I was very close to them. And so I hadn't told Dad is what I called my Jewish father. I hadn't told him everything that was transpiring between me and my father. So, and probably even if I had told him, he would have said the same thing. But I knew, just was positive that we could keep on going with this honest discourse that we had established between each other.
And was his passing a catalyst for any other change? Did it help to bring out more secrets? Did it change your mother at all?
No. I couldn't. The one thing I wanted was the catharsis that my mother had when I took her to the Holocaust Memorial Museum to speak about the escape, to be interviewed. She said, "This is the best thing you've ever done for me. It's made it less frightening. It's made it just part of life." And I just wanted to be able to talk to her. I didn't want to blame her, but she was the one person I wanted to talk to about how I felt about my father and what I had gone through, but not in an angry way, not to say, "You, Mom, look what you did to me," but just because I was so close to her. She always, all my life, she told me I was her best friend. And how could we be best friends if I couldn't talk to her about this? And I could never talk to her about it. She just didn't. I wrote her letters about it. That was the closest I could get to it. And I wrote her letters saying to her, that she just made a mistake and she shouldn't hold it against herself. And he was a good man. It was as far as she went. But I realized that she could never discuss this with me because she knew it must have hurt me. It must have been difficult for me. And she was my mother.
Fascinating. Now, we have quite a large audience tonight, and they have made a few comments and have asked a few questions. So if we can look at those in the few minutes we have left together. Firstly, this is quite interesting. Dolph Morgendorf points out, Sally Noach ended up in London later in the war. There is a documentary in which his daughter, Lady Irene Hatter, goes in search of the man and his story. So people can look for that documentary. It is a film called When Sally, there is a film, quote, when Sally Noach, a young Dutchman, arrived in Britain in the middle of World War II, British intelligence officers doubted his claim to have secured the release of hundreds of imprisoned Jews in southern France. Now, nearly 40 years after his death, his daughter, Lady Irene Hatter, has retraced his steps and uncovered the truth behind her father's wartime exploits in this documentary. So people may well look that up. Now, Claire Ray in Harrogate asks, how did the family get to Suriname? I think you mentioned that bit. They sailed from Lisbon, as I remember. How was it living there, and how did they get from there to the USA?
That's a wonderful question that allows me to tell you something very important about living there. When they went on the ship SS Nyassa, it was arranged by the Joint Distribution Committee who had prodded the Dutch government. And when they got to Paramaribo, all the Jewish refugees on that boat, on that ship, started singing the Dutch national anthem, because they were so happy to be there. And the Dutch governor of Suriname put all of those Dutch refugees, there were no Germans in that group, he put them into a camp behind barbed wire. They slept on cots, women separated from men, even if they were married, and he gave them work duties. The children were able to finish their education. There was a teacher there and who was living in Paramaribo. They stayed there at least 9 months, sometimes maybe longer, but that's how it was when they got there. Of
course, Suriname was part of the Dutch kingdom at that point.
It was a colony.
Yeah. Okay. And from there, what was it that took them to the USA?
Well, my mother got a job with the Dutch government in Suriname as a statistician because she finished her education there in Suriname and eventually got out of the camp. But when the Dutch government saw that she had finished her education, she had a college degree, they gave her a job in the Dutch embassy and in Washington, D.C. So she went alone at age 20, 2 years after the escape, to Washington, D.C., got a job for her sister there, and then the rest of the family followed them all up to Washington, D.C.
Now, we have a question from Jeanette Marks. This is about your new father, and she asks, did he have a European background or any connection to the Holocaust?
He was a Canadian, and his parents had a European background. They had fled pogroms to go to Toronto. He did not have a personal, a direct connection to the Holocaust, only through his wife. He came to the United States because he could not get a residency as a doctor in Canada. So he came to the United States.
Okay. Now, Holly Rosenberg is in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I'm age 67, Jewish from Chicago suburbs. I don't understand. Why wouldn't your mother let you talk about your dad? What do you think she was afraid of? Is it possible he was anti-Semitic and maybe your mother knew that all along?
No, he wasn't anti-Semitic. But she wouldn't let me talk about it because she thought that it would make her look bad as a divorcee. At that time, in the 1950s, being a divorcee was, in Yiddish, it's called a shanda. And it's not something that you wanted people to know.
So does Ingrid Alpen have more stories to tell? Will you be writing something else, or is this it?
I do have other stories, but most of them are about my mother, and I don't know if I'll write them or not, about just more of the females, the side of a woman who wanted to have a career, and she urged all the women in our family, have a career, have a career. You've got to be able to support yourself. You never know what will happen in your life. And there's so many things that caused her to finally give up her career. And that's very sad to me. But I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm writing a lot of advocacy papers for my work.
Would you say the book has a particular message people should take from it?
Well, there are many messages. One message is that empathy can build relationships. It can help us communicate across divisions, asking what makes the other person act the way they do. But I also would say that a message is that I'm not idealistic because I am a Holocaust survivor's kid. So I've seen the Holocaust showed us the absolute worst in people, and it showed us the absolute best in people. People who helped my family, non-Jews, and some of them are mentioned in the book, who risked their own lives to help my family.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you so much for being our guest today, Ingrid. It's been fascinating to talk to you, and to say thank you. We'll send you a copy of some of my photographs. This is Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service in action. I hope you'll enjoy that.
I will.
Might take a little while to reach you, but it's definitely going to be on its way. Now, Ingrid's book is definitely worth a read. It doesn't take more than a few hours, and it really is beautifully written. I bought the Kindle edition, so I don't have a copy to show you, but if you want to order one, please use the link on the Milim website. The book will cost you the same amount of money, but Milim will earn a few pennies. And I have to say, the Kindle edition is an absolute bargain. It's irresistible. You really must buy it and read it. Now, before we leave, let me just tell you a little bit about our program coming up in the next few weeks. Next week on the 31st of January, Yorkshire Scouting historian Colin Walker will be with us, speaking about Scouts at World War II, with some specific Jewish interest that he has discovered especially for us. Then on the 7th of February, we welcome back Tony Zendel. This time he's looking at the life and times of Albert Ballin, the shipping magnate who was known as the Kaiser's Jew. And finally, for now, on the 16th of February, we have Ashley Millett-Martin. He's speaking about army surplus, workers and campers, Millets, the story of a British institution. This is, of course, about the Millets army surplus stores that many of you, I'm sure, will remember. Please do visit our website at milim.org.uk. You can sign up to receive our newsletter there, and that will make sure you don't miss anything we present. All of our events are free, but if you want to make a small donation, please do so on our website or using the link in the chat. That will help us with the costs of putting on these webinars. It remains for me to thank our guest, Ingrid Alpen, once again. Thank you so much, Ingrid.
Thank you, Jonathan. It was such a pleasure being able to meet you and talking with you. Thank you for those great questions.
Thank you so much. That's kind of you. And I'm looking forward to seeing all of you again